Okay, so this next section, lesson 1.2, is all about adding integers, positive and negative numbers, with different signs. So this is where we're going to get into adding 3 positives and 3 negatives, and talking about what happens when we add a negative. And likewise, if we have 3 negatives, what's going to happen if we add 3 positives? So what does this look like, right? What are the answers to these kinds of questions, but also what do they look like on a number line? So that's what we're paying attention to. And a quick note, we want to make sure we understand the words horizontal means left to right. So that's like the horizon is left to right. It's that line that goes left to right that the sun sets on. And then vertical is the up and down line. So when we get vertical, that means we're standing up and down. All right, so adding on a number line, when we have a question like 3 plus 2, all right, we start at the number 3 because that's the first number in the problem, and then we add 2. And because the 2 is positive, all we're going to do is move to the right 2 spaces. This is pretty simple. This is adding a positive and a positive. But here, we're taking a positive 3 and we're adding 2 negatives. So if you have 3 positives and we add 2 negatives, what do we end up with? Well, we're going to use a number line to find out. So here we have 3 positives and 2 negatives. Now, the answer is positive 1, but we want to be able to prove it on a number line. So if we start with positive 3, then we start on the number line here at positive 3. And because we're adding negatives, we're adding a negative number, so we're not going to go to the right because we're not adding 2. We're adding 2 negatives. So we move down or to the left, and we end up at positive 1. So we have to get used to doing that when we see adding a negative. Cool? So now, if we have 4 positives and 3 negatives, we start at 4, and we move 3 units to the left, or in the negative direction. So we're adding a negative. So we want to get used to doing that when we see adding a negative. And the second example here starts on a negative and adds a positive. So we start at negative 7, and we move 5 units in the positive direction. All right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we end up at negative 2. So the number lines are a way for us to prove that negative 7 plus 5 equals negative 2. And then here we have, this is actually the most important one, I think, which is positive 6 positives, and added to 6 negatives. So if we have 6 positives, we're going to start here at positive 6, yes? And then we're going to add 6 negatives. And if we're adding negatives, we're going to go into the negative direction because we're adding negatives. So we move to the left 6 spots, and look where we end up. We end up at 0, all right? So that means that 6 positives, these are little positive signs, 4, 5, 6, and 6 negatives, right? If we add 6 negatives, all right, what happens is each positive and negative cancel each other out until we end up with none left. We end up with 0 left at the end. So we're going to talk about that again in a second. So that's pretty much the most important stuff that we're going to practice doing. And because math is a language, it really does come down to getting used to talking about how to understand 3 and negative 2 using a number line. All right? So here, this page 14, this is where we get into understanding a positive and a negative cancel each other out. A positive and a negative cancel each other out. So when it says the value of a zero pair, they're talking about a positive and a negative canceling each other out. A zero pair is 0. Adding or subtracting 0 to any number does not change its value. So this is 1, right? That's a positive 1 token. This is 0, and this is 0, because these are 0 pairs. Positive 1 and negative 1 cancel each other out. It's 0. All right? Now this is going to matter a whole lot, because if you got your plus 1 and you add a 0 pair and then you add another 0 pair, you still, even though you have 5 tokens in front of you, because these cancel out, you only have positive 1 showing in front of you. That's what we really need to understand about using these tokens to understand positive and negatives and 0 pairs. All right? So in this example here, if we model -6 plus 3, okay, we're going to start with 6 counters to represent -6. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negative counters. Imagine these are red because they have negatives on them. Now we're going to add 3 counters to represent adding positive 3. All right, we're going to add 3 counters. 1, 2, 3. We're adding these. And these are positive counters. Now, do you see how these are going to become 0 pairs? Form 0 pairs. All right, so we formed them. There are 3 0 pairs. So that cancels, that cancels, that cancels. What is left when you remove the 0 pairs? 1 negative, 2 negative, 3 negative. You end up with 3 counters, which are all negative. Yes? So find the sum -6 plus 3. 6 negatives and 3 positives equals -3. So that's what we want to practice if we're going to use these counters. All right? So here we get a nice little chart to help us remember. When you're adding the same sign, the book suggests adding the absolute values of the integers, because 3 and 5 is 8, 2 and 7 is 9, and whether it's both positives or both negatives, you're either counting 3 positives and 5 positives to make 8 positives, or you're taking 2 negatives and adding 7 negatives to get how many negatives? 9 negatives. So when it's the same sign, when you're adding the same sign, you're just adding the numbers together and paying attention to the signs. Cool? Now when they're different signs, subtract the lesser absolute value. That's what they're suggesting. All right? From the greater absolute value. So what they're saying is, when you have 3 positives and you add 5 negatives, what they're suggesting is you take the 5 and you subtract the 3, but you keep the sign of the greater number. 5 minus 3 is what? 2. And you keep the sign of the bigger number. So that's another strategy to use. This book has lots of strategies because lots of people use different strategies in different ways. So it's important for you to find out what makes sense, and the more strategies you know, the more flexible you're going to be when dealing with math as a language. All right? So if you have 10 negatives and 1 positive, again, subtract the lesser from the greater. What's 10 minus 1? It's 9. And which number is greater? The negative one. So we keep that. All right? And here, a number and its opposite. Positive 4 and negative 4, those are 0 pairs. Negative 11 and positive 11, those are 0 pairs. So that's all that's saying here. So then we get into an event of practice, and we're basically practicing whatever strategy makes sense to you to add, notice these are all adding, okay, different signs. So that's what you want to practice, not just doing, but talking about and explaining to somebody how you're adding with different signs. Next video, I get into subtracting these integers.